it's all great in theory, but then, what happens when it comes to I've got to power Google AI overviews or Mr. and Mrs. Jones down the road need to watch the television this evening or need to keep warm in the winter. And you're like,
Sure.
I'm paying for the data center.
Sorry,
You're
Grandma, we have a
cold."
pre-training run. All that and more on today's Mixture of Experts. I'm Tim Hwang, and welcome to Mixture of Experts. Each week, MOE brings together a crack team of the most brilliant and entertaining researchers, product leaders, and more to distill down and chart a path through the ever more complex landscape of artificial intelligence. Today, I'm joined by Abraham Daniels, Senior Technical Product Manager for Granite, Kaoutar Maghraoui, Principal Research Scientist and Manager for Hybrid AI Cloud, and Chris Hay, Distinguished Engineer. We have a packed episode today. We're going to talk about a little bit of a retrospective for R1. We'll talk about a huge data center investment by Google. We'll talk about the adoption of Claude by Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. But today I actually want to start first with Kimi K2. And I think for our round the corn question, we'll do a really simple one, which is Kimi K2, is it overhyped or underhyped? Abraham, curious if you've got any thoughts on that.
Honestly, I don't know. It's from a benchmark perspective, it looks amazing, but I think we have to wait and see from a generalization perspective. It's actually as good as they say.
All right, Chris, what do you think?
It is actually really good, but it's not better than Claude, no matter what the benchmarks say.
All right. And finally, last but not least, Kaoutar, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a little overhyped, but yes, it's a very good model.
Okay, a lot to get in here, too. I love these opinions. They're like, maybe good, maybe bad. So just give a quick background for folks who may have not been watching this. So Kimi K2 is a new model that dropped from the Alibaba-backed startup Moonshot. And it's an open source model, notably. And it's been kind of really storming the charts. There's been a lot of chatter about it online. People are saying it's the best thing since sliced bread. And I think the most interesting thing about the launch is that the Moonshot company has basically claimed that against benchmarks, it is surpassing the latest state of the art for Claude and GPT-4, particularly on coding benchmarks, which is a big deal, right? The idea that on this specialist task of coding, this open source model is now challenging, the biggest players in the game. And Abraham, maybe I'll start with you because I thought your response was maybe a good way into this discussion. You were saying, well, hey, it looks great, but we actually don't know yet if it's any better. What do you mean by that? Tell us more.
Well, a couple of things. One, in public benchmarks, and, as we've spoken in a number of these, Mixture of Experts episodes can be gained, and they don't always tell the full story. So although, they may have published that they're better than Cloud and GPT until we can actually get some independent or third party or see what the community actually thinks, I think it's, maybe the claim is a little bigger than it really is. Also, it's, I don't know, my opinion that there's a lot of kind of craze at the beginning and then things kind of settle down and we kind of figure out where it really stands. So I'm cautiously optimistic about its performance, but I'd like to just see some real world applications, whether that's, integrating to certain stacks or, actually demonstrating side-by-side comparisons, whether this is actually as good as they say it is.
Yeah, for sure. And Chris, I think maybe I'll turn to you next. I think the caution is well warranted. And I think at this point, I barely look at the benchmarks in the blog post when they announce models, because I'm like, it's all gameable, it's all trash. But you seem to be convinced. You're like just on playing around with it, it's a good model, but it is definitely not as good as Claude and GPT-4. What leads you to say that?
Putting my hands on the keyboard and typing stuff in and seeing what comes
All right,
out.
give me more than that, though, of course. But this is more than just a vibe check, right? You actually think against certain tasks, you think that this is not surpassing the state of the art here.
No, I don't think so. So the first thing I would say, it is by far, in my humble opinion, it is the best open source model out there at the moment, or open weight model. They have done a phenomenal job. I mean, it's a 1 trillion parameter model. So this thing is big. Okay, it is a mixture of expert model with a lot of models, but it's still a big model, and and you need a lot of disk space to get that running on your machine. Now, but it is the best model for an open source, but it doesn't beat Claude. And There are a lot of things that I think are really good for this model. I mean, when I was playing with it, I really liked its planning capability. I really liked its tool use. So this is a model that is definitely being designed for agentic behavior, right? They've really focused on the planning. They've really focused on the use of tools. And I think that is going to be exciting when we run a smaller model because, to be honest, when you want to run agents, I said agents, of course, but when you want to run agents, you want your models to be small and fast and lean. And I think it's going to do a phenomenal job as well. The other thing is, it's not a reasoning model, so it doesn't have that thinking capability yet. They've just provided a base model and an instruct model. But it is fabulous for the chat. So code wise, or to sort of come back to what I said there, Tim, right? Code wise, I think open source open weight model, it is the best coding model out there. I've used pretty much every single one of these models, whether it's the Quen models, whether it's DeepSeek, etc. It really is the best coding model out there for an open weight model. But it doesn't beat Claude, right? It may beat it on the benchmarks, and back to Abraham's point, right, which is a lot of these things are gained towards the benchmarks to try and get that sort of edge. But when you put it in real coding scenarios, right? I want to code up this particular program, change this, do this, whatever. It does a good job, but Claude is better, right? I mean, Claude is giving me better results than I'm seeing from my vibe checks. But fair play to them. I don't take anything against that. It is an incredible model, and for kind of the budget, the compute, the time that they've had, again, spectacular.
Kaoutar, I know you came in basically saying that you felt like it was a little bit of an overhyped launch. And so do you kind of buy Chris? You're basically like, very good, but still like, as compared to the proprietaries, I think it's still lagging a little bit behind.
Yeah. So, but I think, there are also other angles that, this release or this launch is kind of getting us to start thinking about, which is more on this evolving war on the cost, the open source versus, the proprietary APIs. So if you look at companies like OpenAI or, Anthropic or Google, they're charging per token for API access. But, these open source models with models like Kimi K2, Llama, or Mistral, the cost here is shifting from these API free to a fixed or at least predictable infrastructure cost, so you're paying more for the compute. So it's like we're getting, with models like, it is a great model. I played with it a little bit, but it's kind of where the good enough tipping points. So for, many business tasks, summarization, classification, and et cetera, these open models are doing a pretty good job, or even superior than, the closed ones. So now I think we're kind of getting into this phase where companies, can now adopt, this hybrid strategy, use maybe expensive proprietary models for maybe complex frontier tasks, but then offload the bulk of their workload to really cheaper or self-hosted open source models. So, but I also feel, with, this launch, we're kind of getting into this maturation of the open source AI movement. I mean, it just didn't happen with Kimi K2, but also with the other, open source models. So it's no longer about, providing a free alternative, but also about competing directly on performance and features with these, other, closed source models. So I think with this release, it's also kind of pushing for, towards putting more pressure on the pricing models of these proprietary giants like OpenAI and Google, and kind of putting a lot of pressure on them. So the future of these enterprise AI is not just a single vendor solution. I think it's kind of we're leaning toward more cost optimized portfolios, hybrid models, and I think Kimi's K2 success or really great performance signals that the primary battleground in AI here is shifting from this pure performance race to kind of a war of economic efficiency and also like the strategic control.
Yeah, and I think I did want to pick up on the strategic control point. There's an interesting observation that some people are making, which is, okay, I know this group is maybe a little skeptical about sort of K2's ultimate capabilities on coding, but like assume for a moment that it is actually better than what Claude and like say OpenAI can provide. A lot of people are pointing out that actually now it's actually a little bit difficult for Kimi to compete in that universe because a lot of people are on platforms and endpoints that are using all the existing leading proprietary models. And I guess, Abraham, maybe I'll throw it to you because I know you're working with Granite day in, day out. Like, do you think that there's kind of this really interesting dynamic emerging where now the kind of like pre-existing install base, effectively, if you will, for these models, particularly in coding, like means that it's actually really difficult for like a new model, even if it's better, to get in and actually compete with these proprietaries? Do you buy that at all?
Not really. I think it's less about whether if it's better or not. And to Kaoutar's point, it's really what are the economics of using this model versus, vendor lock-in or locking into a particular stack or infrastructure. I think the question really is it good enough where the price tag aligns with our business case or our use case. And I think you're consistently seeing that these, open source is now a strategic weapon as opposed to just a mandate by an organization where you're starting to disrupt a lot of these, closed source models. And when you can actually brush up against their performance, whether that's, R1 on reasoning or Kimi 2 or Kimi K2 on coding, you're really signaling to the market that, one, vendor lock-in, my opinion, vendor lock-in was always going to be kind of dismantled as you had a proliferation of developers. It was going to kind of erase to the bottom, but this really just kind of expedites it. And then two, I think there's also, developer-centric pricing is going to continue to force a downward pressure. And I think over the last 6 months, you've seen an actual explosion in costs per input and output tokens. So I mean, personally, I think this is amazing. Granted, as a model, we are huge proponents of open source licensing with, no things open sourcing. So I think this is the right direction, not only for the field. And then maybe I also think this is kind of signaling to, Llama and OpenAI that they have to start to take this very seriously in terms of how this bakes into their roadmap too. So with, OpenAI starting to, or hinting at another open source model, the first since GP2. So personally, back to your question, I don't think this is necessarily an issue. I think this is really just it's an economics question more so than a technology question.
The second topic of today that I really wanted to get into was zooming out from Kimi K2, right? Someone pointed out to me recently we're 6 months since the R1 launch, and which is amazing because R1 launched January 2025. It already feels like it was 6 years ago, not just 6 months ago. But I think it might be good for us to kind of just talk for a few minutes, zooming back a little bit on like what has changed since R1 launched. And I think, Abraham, you're picking up, I think, on one thing that I did want to bring up, which is, in the midst of all this, OpenAI announced that it would be kind of delaying indefinitely the launch of its open source model, which was kind of way hyped and was originally read as kind of a response to this new generation of Chinese open source models, but now appears to be kind of like on the back burner. Well, back burner is maybe the wrong word, but delayed for an unknown amount of time. I guess, Chris, maybe to throw it to you, like, do you feel like the US companies in some ways have like not been able to kind of like answer this open source challenge at all, right? Like, I think in some ways, like Meta's still competing, but OpenAI is not really open sourcing. It feels like there hasn't been another kind of marquee model that says, oh, okay, actually, a lot of these kind of dominant US companies can kind of keep up in this race.
I think there's different economics and power shifts in play in this sense. I don't think there's any reason why OpenAI or Anthropic can't release an open weight model, right? They're obviously choosing to do other things there. I stick by my statement that I said earlier for size. I think the best open weight models out there are the DeepSeeks. That is the now suppressed by the Kimi K2 model. The Mistral models are incredible. They're open weight models, especially their 24 billion parameter one and the Mistral Medium. They're really great models. And I love what we're doing with Granite, with the 7B models or the 8B models, right? Everybody, and the 1B models, I think everybody's forgetting about these really small models, right? And actually they become super important, especially for things like agents. So I think they're missing a trick. I mean, the only American company that's really producing good open weight models is Google Google at the moment, and IBM obviously, but I'm meaning on the kind of the higher number of parameters. So I think there is more to do in that effort, and that's it's running away from there. So I'd like to see that position change, because the reality is, there's a risk for all of these companies, which is once you start to get competitive models, and you're not going to compete with a trillion parameter model, but if you can get a really great coding model down to the 8 billion parameter number, and again, I don't think that's far off when you think about some of the, like Michelle's doing with the 24 billion parameters, then all right, back to Kautar's point about cost economics, if I can run something on my laptop and I can get good code from it, or I can run good agents from it, that starts to affect their business model. So I'm a big fan of OpenWay, a big fan of open source. I really like to see all the closed source providers open up their models and open up their weights. I'd like to see that as good, just get it done.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think that's one thing I did want to get to. And Kautar, I guess you've been name checked, so I'll kind of bring the conversation back to you. Is like, there's obviously different economics, and the kind of sort of U.S. leading companies are like trying a couple different things in the space. But it is kind of interesting to me that it feels like the number of kind of like I guess when I think about open source, I think like, oh well, there's going to be tons and tons of different players putting out lots and lots of different models, and we're going to see this space really, really kind of open up. I mean, to Chris's point, even though the Chinese market has kind of like really invested in open source, it still feels like after 6 months, DeepSeek is really still kind of like in the lead here, right? Like that actually we haven't seen like an explosion of new companies offering open source models in the space that are kind of at least as competitive. I guess the question I kind of want to get you to respond to is like whether or not you think there's like a special discipline with doing open source models that's maybe different from closed source. Like, is there like a different style of what's going on here that actually is almost as difficult as doing a closed source model well?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think what really, I think helped DeepSeek is the efficiency, aspect of it. So I think the key innovation was mostly behind their architectural efficiency, where they employed, the bag of techniques of mixture of experts, reinforcement learning, optimizations all the way to the level of the PTX, etc. So that was, I didn't think that was kind of maybe a kind of a breakthrough thing, but more, efficient implementations, clever ways of using existing techniques. So, and of course, there is an ongoing debate about the nature of, DeepSeek's achievements. While, some of them view that, their methods are revolutionary breakthroughs, I'm more, along the sides of those that, that think that, it's a clever and effective implementations of existing techniques rather than a fundamental paradigm shift. But that was, I think, the efficiency was very important because, showing that you can get, to these state of the art models with less costs. That was, I think, a very important shift, that they have showcased here. And since then, we've seen, many releases where they kept improving their models. So they have this steady, flow of releases where they kept improving. So that was really great to see. So going to your question, what's kind of maybe the recipe here? I think, of course, being able to be state of the art, kind of beating these benchmarks, but also having the capability to do these things efficiently. But if you see like 6 months, from their launch, have they kind of shaken the market? Have they kind of, like especially the closed source ones? Probably not that much. The enterprise uptake for, DeepSeek, I feel it still remains unlimited. And I think it's mostly due to regulatory and compliance and some of the tooling blockers. So the adoption, of course, is mostly concentrated in Chinese-based startups and hobbyist communities. But then, if you look at, in the West and in the US, and so the enterprise uptake is still limited. Um, and it's mostly, I think, of course, in the academic and the specialized domain, there is a lot of traction here. Like a lot of researchers are leveraging R1 for math problem solving, code generation, and, especially for the Chinese language medical diagnostics, for example. But then, in the enterprise, I think I feel it's still limited. And maybe that's also kind of part of this geopolitical AI race where we've seen it is getting intensified. So because DeepSeek's open source strategy is encouraging, the rivals, for example, Moonshot AI, like we're seeing with Kimi K2, to follow here, and especially to kind of trying to partially bypass the US controls or the US chip controls. So that is really something that is so important for them. But what we see also on the Western governments, they're really trying to double down on this trustworthy AI frameworks, which is becoming very important.
Yeah, I think this is so a lot to unpack there. And I think you're getting to something I think is really interesting is I think the narrative when R1 launched was, oh man, all of these American companies are suddenly in trouble because you have this incredibly powerful model and it's available for free, right? And I think 6 months on, my kind of reflection is counter the same as yours, which is actually like enterprise adoption has been kind of less than I would have thought. And that's pretty interesting, right? That like in some ways the market dynamics that we kind of originally thought with R1 and particularly around open source don't necessarily seem to be playing out the way we thought. I guess Abraham, do you have any responses to that? Like it's kind of odd to me that like you have this incredibly great model that's like available for free, and we just haven't seen like mass adoption in a 6 month period. Like if anything, the proprietary, like your open AIs or Anthropics of the world seem, they're changing the strategy, but they're not like completely demolished as a result of this change.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it. I think it was less of like competition with respect to another model that's in the queue in terms of what your enterprise is going to use. I think it was just more of like what the strategy was. The status quo pre R1 shifted to be able to differentiate from R1. So where closed models were clearly ahead, open weight was able to give you parity on key reasoning tasks. So it shifted to let's get smarter, cheaper inference as the goal. Agents were agentic orchestration was already kind of, bubbling up, but everybody doubled down on, being able to develop an LLM that was, a key supporter of agentic workflows. Safety was also doubled down too in terms of, our models are, safe from the, red teaming, from a governance, from an AI perspective, both on the model and the data side. So I think it was really just a shift in strategy from like a model capability PR, if you will, perspective in order to differentiate from R1 to showcase that, we are moving forward as a, US based or Western model developer companies. And less of a, R1 was now considered a viable option as part of like an enterprise use case.
It's really interesting. Chris, maybe a final comment, again, pulling out of kind of Kaoutar's theme. I think, Kaoutar, you've pointed out, I think, this really interesting thing, which is, well, maybe part of R1's genius is its dedication to efficiency, right? They were able to assemble all these hacks together to really squeeze a lot of results without having a whole lot of resources. And I think a little bit about like what it means to be efficiency minded, and how it can be really hard to kind of like think in that style if you're used to having like the most compute and the most money in the entire world. And I guess, Chris, I don't know if there's almost kind of a thesis here that I want to run by you, which is like, could it be hard for American companies to pivot into this, which is a big deal if you think that like small open source models are going to be like the future of agents? Is it hard for these companies to pivot into this kind of efficiency mindset? Because in some ways, technically, I think they're like maybe so used to an environment where it's like we never have to think about scrappily how to assemble all these things to squeeze the most results out of limited resources. I'm curious about if you think that's almost like a barrier in some ways to these companies pivoting towards open source.
I think that when you are limited by your resources, you become super creative. And actually, if we think about the Kimi K2 scenario, they got super creative, right? One of the biggest things that they did is they came up with their new optimizer, right? The Muon optimizer, which was really about them being able to train very, very large models in a consistent way, and not basically have their training losses mess up during that process. That is a huge moment. Now, we don't know all the details behind that, but the innovation there is great. They've moved away from the optimizers others are using, right? When I think about the DeepSeek moment and their efficiency, they similarly, but nobody really cared about DeepSeek, but when they first launched anyway, DeepSeek V3 came out in December, but it wasn't until they released R1 where we got excited. And it's because they had the reasoning model, and it was pretty much close to the O series of models. there, right? And then they were open about how they published it. They went through their RL flow on how they trained the GRPO stuff, etc. And we all learned stuff and it was all great, but they were innovative. And the great thing is they were open about it and everybody's been running around copying their techniques and learning from them. Kimi K2 wouldn't exist if DeepSeek V3 wasn't open about how they trained the V3 model. So I think that in itself is going to boost that creativity. But to your point, I'm not quite sure if you're just sitting there with, hundreds of thousands of H100s. I'm not sure you've got all the compute you need, right? I'm not sure you're going to be so, you're just going to get your job done as opposed to like going, oh, I can't do this because I don't have this and I need to figure my way out of it. So I think that is helping them. But why is DeepSeek maybe 6 months on, to your point? I'm going to call it the Patrick Mahomes effect, right? There are great quarterbacks kicking around. Tom Brady was the greatest, and then great quarterbacks who come along. You go, oh, there's Jared Goff. They're like, you're like, oh, okay. Even Justin Herbert, people who shoot me for that, they'll go, okay. Do you know what I mean? Because you're not seeing anything amazing over time. You get used to them. But then when you look at Patrick Mahomes play and you're like, how did he do that? No human on earth is able to make that throw. How did he do? He wasn't even looking. And I don't think those models are quite doing that yet, right? Because the models that have come out are equivalent or thereabouts the same as the models. And nobody really cares about the same, right? If you think of if you think of Super Bowl or what, nobody remembers who lost the Super Bowl. They're close enough to the team that won, right? But people care about the winners, the greatest, right? So I think for one of these to take hold and really upset OpenAI, Anthropic, etc., they're gonna have to do something like the no model has ever done before. It's just like, oh, I press a button and it's created an entire $1 billion company overnight. Wow. And it's done it on a chip that runs on my laptop. Then we'll be like, oh,
I mean, that
you're
would be
not
pretty
going to care.
impressive. I would be impressed.
Nobody's going to care at that point. You think you're going to stick on, oh no, I'm going to stick typing in ChatGPT. You're like, no, I'm running over to the new thing. I've got to see that. Whereas if it's just like, it's the same as it was before, you're like, well, it's just the same. I'll stick with what I've got. That's what needs to change.
And also, I think the first movers advantage always has a big, effect. If, I think OpenAI with ChatGPT, kind of gained a lot of, mass adoption. And so once you get used to that, sometimes switching from that environment to something else, you really need to have, like Chris say, something completely kind of a wow effect, something not just incremental. And I think, Tim, going to back to your like the resources or the compute question. So even R1 kind of shakes the GPU dominance, the NVIDIA GPU. So the stock dipped significantly, like 17%. But then the demand for NVIDIA hardware kind of rebounded because large scale inference still relies a lot on GPU. So I mean, we had a panic moment, but the efficiency gains, really haven't negated the massive compute needs that are still there.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, we'll be checking in again in another 6 months. I think kind of like using R1 as a peg and kind of moving out, I think is really useful just because the space moves so quickly. I'm going to move us on to our next topic. Announcement coming out of Pittsburgh, really big event this week. The president was there, all the major companies were there. But I think there's one announcement in particular I want to zoom in on, which is Google announced that it'd be making a $25 billion, that's with a B, announcement to invest in energy infrastructure. So for one part, hydropower in Pennsylvania, and then also something that's known as the PJM Interconnect, right, which is a network grid that stretches across New Jersey, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, a really large area of the country. And, I think this is in some ways like taking a step back, like both wild, both in terms of the dollar amount being committed, but also just to remind ourselves that like Google is like a company that started doing search, right? And so it's not intuitively obvious that you would eventually say years later, we're going to be investing billions of dollars in going all the way upstream to really literally change like the energy grid of a whole part of the country. And so I guess Abraham, question for you is just like how far you think this all goes, right? Like at some point, does Google just say we're going to be owning and operating a nuclear power plant? Like it feels like in some ways AI is generating such demand on the grid. These companies really need to assure energy access. And at some point it kind of feels like, okay, where this all goes is like vertical integration. You can subscribe to have your energy bill sent to you from Google. Is that where this is all going?
I mean, it's a great question. I think you can. Microsoft and Meta have both, committed massive amounts of money to build their own data centers. I think Google's taken a different approach in terms of not only building a data center, but what I think was missing with the prior ones is investing in the actual grid themselves, as well as investing in the community around them. Um, so to your question, maybe it kind of makes sense if you talk about the actual cost of power to be able to manage these data centers. If anything, I kind of, clap to Google to actually take a more of a holistic approach in terms of being able to create, compute or create data centers. Because I feel one thing that's typically missing is, getting a better understanding of what the impact of these data centers are to the surrounding, whether it's the grid, the, ecosystem, this takes a ton of water to be able to cool these things. So the runoff. So I think from Google's perspective, they did a more of a holistic approach, which I kind of applaud to. I think this is only can continue to happen. And you kind of mentioned, nuclear energy. Like I think the next step is really better understanding, whether it's hydropower, electricity, nuclear, like where's all this energy actually going to come from? Because it's, depending on what you read, by 2030, data centers are going to represent 1% to 3% of all power on the grid. And right now it just can't, support that, let alone manage it. So it's really kind of focusing on how do we support today? And then how are these hyperscalers going to invest in the grid if they're going to be the primary user of the energy coming off of it? Because there are some downstream impacts. I mentioned, environmental, but when you have all these data centers or these players, integrating into the grid, that drives electricity costs up for, your everyday consumer. And, some of the areas that these grids are built by, these data centers are built in, middle America. These aren't areas where, you typically have, access to as much as you would maybe like in New York or Boston or in San Francisco. So, I think it's just important to kind of take a little bit more of like a long tail view in terms of, building out the grid and building out these data centers and really focusing on, what are the impacts above and beyond, the business side of things, and what are the impacts from like, the surrounding community and environment.
Yeah. Kaoutar, you think about hardware a lot. And I think that, one of the things I love about AI is how it just kind of inverts our sense of what's abundant and what's scarce. Like I think a few years ago, you would have said, oh, there's just so much data. We're never going to run out of data. And then I think in AI land, we routinely have conversations where we're like, how do we get the next most valuable tokens? And it feels like for a long time, at least in what we're talking about here, like hardware felt like the real bottleneck, which is like, can you get access to Jensen's chips? That really was the big thing. Over the longer run, though, the midterm, like let's say 5 to 10 years, like do you think energy becomes the new bottleneck? Like at some point, I think like there will be more chips, there will be more GPUs, there'll be more suppliers of those GPUs. There'll be changes in models that maybe make the specific hardware less necessary. But it kind of feels like maybe where this is going is that whatever hardware platform you use, the energy demand is just going to be enormous. And so should the world of AI start to think about like energy becoming a bottleneck?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's interesting to see this shift from chip shortage to power shortage. So I think, like you said, for the last few years, the main AI bottleneck was securing enough GPUs, enough NVIDIA GPUs. But now it seems like the new bottleneck is physical, securing land, permits, and most, importantly, access to these massive amounts of stable electricity. Because the data centers, of course, is useless if you can't power and cool it. And I think even utility companies, they're they're reporting that requests for new data center connections are really overwhelming their capacity and forecasting capabilities. So, I think wait time for, large scale power connections can be years long. So this is kind of pushing to this sustainability challenge that's we're going to be facing. And I think we already started seeing these things. So this massive increase, in energy demands puts enormous pressure on the climate goals here. So how do we power, this AI revolution without relying on fossil fuels? So, and that's what, Google is doing here. So I think this is forcing big tech companies to become also energy players. So they are now among, I think, the largest purchasers of these renewable energy through like the power purchase agreement, like the PPAs. And I think Google's investment here is likely, you know, tied also this new solar, wind, and potentially next generation geothermal or even nuclear projects to meet, its carbon-free energy goals. So of course, I think what Google is doing, this is a massive investment. It's just confirming that the AI race right now is officially an industrial scale energy and infrastructure race. So, and like you said, the new bottlenecks right now, it's going to become energy.
Chris, one of the things I'm wondering if you can opine on is I think a little bit about the like downstream effects of all this, right? Which is you're just building a lot more energy capacity. But like the nice thing about energy is you can use it for all sorts of things, right? You could use it for industrial manufacturing. There's all sorts of things that happen when energy becomes more available. And I guess I'm curious about how you like think a little bit about that. I mean, I guess maybe I'll put it in the most dramatic way. Like if you're a cynic, you might be like, all of this AI stuff is a huge bubble. And at some point, it's all going to fall apart. Even if that's the case, at that point, we would have built this huge electrical grid, which is kind of like this really interesting outcome. Is basically like it almost feels like AI is now making things happen that are going to have all these downstream effects that have like things that nothing to do with AI at all. So yeah, I don't know. Is like I'm curious if there's like maybe to put a question on it is like if there's particular effects that you think are the most interesting here.
I don't know if I'm honest, and it's not often I say I don't know, but I imagine if we went back 150 years and Google made steam trains. I'm like, do I need 100,000 steam trains? Do I need millions of tracks of clackety wood railways? And I'm like, I don't know. Do you know what I mean? I'm
Like
just
America
not.
cannot fall behind on building railroads. Yeah.
Yeah, and then it would be like, and then you're like, we need more kettles to fill up the engine with water. You know what I mean? I'm not sure, and like the downstream effect is like, it's all great in theory, but then what happens when it comes to I've got to power Google AI overviews or Mr. and Mrs. Jones down the road need to watch the television this evening or need to keep warm in the winter. And you're like,
Sure.
I'm paying for the data center.
Sorry,
You're
Grandma, we have a
cold.
pre-training run.
Exactly. And so I don't really know how that works out logistic wise. And I worry about then big, massive dams filled with water for the cooling. And then the poor person at the other end of that dam going, I've got no water in my, I think there's a lot of effects. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure how this works. What I would like to see is people figuring out how to get more energy efficient electricity, etc. How to bring down the cost of compute. Have more efficient models. I mean, in theory, I think it all sounds great. That if you can have the infrastructure and the energy, and then regular people are gonna, as opposed to AI people, are gonna get the benefit of that, then I think it's wonderful. But I don't know. I don't know if we're gonna have like some big wasteland at the end of this. So, but maybe they're going about it all wrong, right? Well, who says the data centers need to be on planet Earth? Why not just load it in a big rocket ship, push it towards the sun? You know what I mean? You get all the energy you want in space, and then just send the model weights down. So maybe they're doing it all wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that's kind of you're getting to. I think what I was interested in was basically like how much of this is really required for the future of AI. What are all the alternative structures we could imagine building? But there's a lot to talk about there.
And maybe we'll get lucky. Maybe one of these compute like the Alibabas, the Moonshots, etc. Maybe because they're so GPU constrained, they'll come up with a model that runs really small, and then we won't need it.
Totally. Yeah. There's, I think, an alternative world where it's just like, actually, maybe if some of what we think is going to happen, say we buy, Chris, your theory about like, okay, in agent world, you're going to mostly need smaller models that can kind of run locally and on devices. You're like, if that ends up being the major commercial use for this technology, what is all this huge investment for on energy infrastructure? And I think that's a very real outcome potentially.
But maybe there are just going to be more and more usage of those things that's just going to, drive, more, demand on the electricity. It's like right now the phones, even, they're kind of relatively low power, but the massive, usage of the phones is still going to increase the energy. So if we have, all these AIs in all devices, all embedded devices everywhere, so it's still going to be, I think, a big energy footprint that is needed to sustain all of these things. So I think the energy problem is still going to be there, whether we go towards smaller models or we still have a hybrid approach with big and smaller models. Energy is still going to be an issue. And I'm worried, like, Chris said, what's the imbalance this is going to create? The new wars, they're going to be, I mean, are we going to kind of increase, the divide between, the poor and the wealthy and accessibility to, the basic things to live in favor of powering these models and things like that. So that is something I think that's a bit scary.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Tank Girl,
totally.
the movie becomes a documentary as opposed to a movie. And everybody's going to go and Google that now and go, what is Chris talking about?
What is Chris talking about? All right, last segment, which we're going to do really quickly. As usual, way more to talk about than we have time for. Fun small announcement that Anthropic made on its blog recently. They basically announced that one of their customers, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, one of the big national labs in the US, has decided to kind of expand their installation of Claude to expand across the entire laboratory, right? So this is a license of their core product that goes to 10,000 scientists. So on some level, this is just, hey, you got a new customer, you got a bigger customer, that's great. But I think what's really interesting is they went a little bit into detail on what scientists at Lawrence Livermore are using Claude for. And, one of them, I'll just read it, quote, we're basically, they're saying like the scientists are using basically Claude for processing and analyzing complex data sets, generating hypotheses, exploring new research directions with an AI assistant that understands scientific context. And the idea here is to literally use sort of agentic or, in the very least, kind of AI assistants to accelerate scientific discovery. And I guess, Abraham, maybe to throw it to you, this is like a pretty big deal, it feels like, right? I know in the past we've talked a little bit about like, well, is AI going to accelerate science? This seems to be like a big lab saying we're going to make a bet on this technology. Do you feel we're now kind of entering an era where AI is really going to actually be accelerating science?
I mean, I think it already has, to be honest. Like, I think this is just more of like a publicly facing PR piece demonstrating one of the biggest research firms in the US, if not the world, using AI to accelerate science. I think what this is really cool, what I think is really cool here is, the agentic kind of validated the agentic framework in a kind of like in a high stakes environment, if you will. But yeah, I think this is kind of, an early indication of what we can do. What I think is, well, I wouldn't say neat, but like is the these are really highly like, secure spaces, if you will, or like, in terms of the science behind it, like having an agent, and I don't know whether this is like, an agent that is unmonitored or whether there's some type of human in the loop validation scheme as part of the workflows. But yeah, I think look from the perspective of using cloud and using it in a way to, drive, scientific discovery. Like I think that's amazing, but two, I'm also kind of cautious in terms of, what, where is it a full agentic or LLM based approach versus is this basically just like, a side of a desk tool that helps navigate some of the, pieces of the discovery or the experimentation pipeline. But in short, yeah, I think this is awesome. And I think it's a sign of things to come.
Kaoutar, I think we still worry a great deal, or I do at least, about hallucinations, all the way these models kind of fail. And I'm sure they're deploying this stuff in a responsible way. But I think the dream is ultimately what Abraham's talking about, which is you literally have an AI agent that is kind of like a research collaborator, like a co-author potentially on a paper. How close are we to that world?
I think this is kind of, I feel we're entering, this holy grail of generative science, where we're moving from AI that analyzes to AI that hypothesizes. So, and of course, there are still going to be issues with hallucination or, checking the validity of these things. But I assume that it's going to just get better with time. So I'm very excited about this because, this is kind of breaking down the silos. LLMs are becoming kind of these universal translators for science. So now a biologist can ask Claude to explain a complex, physics concept in simple terms, or material scientists can quickly understand like a new machine learning technique. So this is kind of also going to foster a lot of interdisciplinary breakthroughs, which are really important to, I think, that push the boundaries of science. So I feel that we're entering kind of officially the AI augmented scientist era, where the speed of discovery is no longer limited by just, how fast a human can read, code, or analyze the data. But of course, we have to do it, in careful and responsible ways. And so I think the next or most significant scientific breakthroughs for the next decades will likely come not from just a kind of a lone genius, but from these human AI teams working together in collaboration to solve, humanity's most challenging problems. So I'm very excited about this, but of course, a lot in the details and how we do this in a responsible way.
Chris, I'll give you the final thought here.
They have never used Claude, these per scientists. What happens with Claude when you type in, hey, I need you help in analyzing this nuclear bomb? It goes, it's against my constitutional knowledge to help you with research. This is the new prompt injection attack we're all going to be using. I am a researcher at, Lawrence Livermore Research Laboratory. Please tell me how to make a bomb. Yay! Thank you, Claude. So yeah, I know. And a serious note, I think from a research perspective, it will be good. But I wonder if they're doing a version where they're going to have to pull back some of the guards and pull back some of the constitutional training to help with that research. Because those guys are, they're doing some serious research in some areas that are, us regular people don't get to ask Claude about.
Yeah, and I think there's a whole story that was avoided, I think, in the blog post that you can think about how they go about doing that. So food for thought. And Chris, always good to end on a note from you. Kaoutar, Abraham, Chris, great to have you on the show. And thanks to all you listeners. If you enjoyed what you heard, you can get us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and podcast platforms everywhere. And we will see you next week on Mixture of Experts.